in September, we went to 4 cities and we began asking some questions. What would it take to fix some serious problems in our processes, systems, in the way that we move resources into this whole community investment situation, context? And we talked about, and they're going to give better detail than this, but we landed on the fact that we as organizations kind of create a weird situation with our peculiar, unique programs, and we begin to create silos for the way we do it compared to the other ways other companies do it. And the result is that we have a whole bunch of great technology out there that's trying to keep up with all of our different demands, and it makes for a very odd situation. So the thing I liken it to is this. Back in the day, I don't know if you remember this, but a few hundred years ago, everything was handmade. Nobody put handmade on their shop or their store or their product because everything was handmade. There was nothing else to make it with but our hands. We had no machines. Machines hadn't been made by hand, so everything was very unique. If you had a gun, you had to go to the hands that made that gun to get a new part for that gun, or it just wasn't going to work. You couldn't replace pieces with other pieces. So this showed up in a very weird place in the world because the Royal Navy needed pulleys. You know what a pulley is for the Royal Navy? It's when you had a sailing ship, it was made by hand, you had a pulley, and these were all made by hand, individual pulleys, and they had to make new pulleys. And this one guy suggested to the British Parliament, he said, you need a lot of ships fast, and we can make a lot of ships fast, but I need 100 people over 100 days to make 1,000 pulleys. But if I can create a machine that can machine them all the same way, exactly, I can do it over 10 days with 10 people. Everybody thought he was ridiculous, he was laughed at, but he did do that. And that's one of the first examples of the machinery revolution. It's often equated with the American machine revolution. And it is the one thing that a famous guy, Mr. Ford, put into play that allowed us to have the assembly line, because you cannot have an assembly line if all the parts aren't the same. If the screws are not all the same size, I can't just screw it in. We have to go hand make that, right? Which is a pain. The whole idea of going back to a handmade world is terrible. We should never do that. We'd all have one pair of pants, one shirt, one pulley. That's it. That's all you get your whole life. That's your pulley. You can't afford another one. They're too expensive. Well, we have done this with technology and employee engagement. We are demanding handmade products for our unique situations, and it is crazy because we can't bring scale to it. Now, Kevin was here last year, and he pounded on the podium, and he said he had a dream. And he went away, and he tried to make that dream come true. And he did a little bit. But he came back to talk about how we can go further. And that's what this session is about. This session is about creating standards and systems that will take us out of the handmade technology solutions into a bright new future where we can create efficiencies and do more than we ever imagined possible. And this is going to be difficult, but this is what we're after. So to set this up, now that everybody's here, that was just a long prologue that was not written down anywhere. I just made that all up. The pulley thing is true. You can look that up in Wikipedia. I'm going to introduce the folks on our panel, and we're going to dive into this. This is going to be a participative exercise, so we are going to workshop this at our tables. Kevin Espirito, right here. He is the Senior Manager of Employee Engagement at Microsoft, and he's been there for over 15 years. Microsoft Citizenship and Public Affairs. Enough said. Sharon Carlson is a Senior Vice President of National Campaign Services at Earthshare. She's been there for over 11 years. She's got tons of experience on the nonprofit side of things. She's going to bring that perspective to the congregation. Yeah, that's what we are. We're a congregation. Conversation. Bridget Sweeney, who almost didn't make it today because of snow, smoke, and desperate situations in Chicago, which is just like every day at Chicago O'Hare. She is the Director of Business Operations for Boeing Global Corporate Citizenship. She oversees the strategic alignment, technology systems, and execution of all financial components of Boeing's citizenship program. So she's going to bring the perspective of a company that needed a different way forward. And then Sheila Warren is here. She's the one smiling. Is the Vice President of Alliances and General Counsel of TechSoup Global. Now, if you've not heard of TechSoup Global, they're a 501c3 social enterprise that has facilitated $5 billion in tech donations and grants for over 100 donor partners and has created community-based technology platforms supporting 600,000 NGOs in 100 countries. They have an incredible global network. They have people on the ground in these countries all over the place. They work in multiple languages and currencies. They do it all. In fact, when it comes to setting the standard for in-kind donation as far as it relates to technology, the government asks them what they should do, right? That's not an overstatement. Okay, so, and Sheila is behind the brains of all, is the brains behind all of that, or maybe is behind the brains of all of that, I don't know.
Maybe.
All right, so let's get started. I want to have Sharon go first. You don't need a mic? You have that, but you're mic'd up, right? You're all right, mic'd up. Okay, I'll stop talking. Sharon's going to kick off our conversation from the nonprofit perspective on this whole issue.
Right. Am I on? Hello? No? I'm not on, am I? No. Hello?
Is it your button?
I'm on.
There is a button.
There's a button.
Okay. I was told not to touch it, and I obey orders. Okay, so hi, everyone. I feel very humbled sitting among this very distinguished panel, but I was asked to present the charity perspective in how we have been trying to navigate through the changing landscape of workplace giving. And it has been challenging. We all like to think that technology is the answer to everything, but sometimes when technology starts to advance, it's not yet streamlined and it's more work before you get past that point, and then it starts clicking and it runs like a really sound machine. So what I thought I would start out with the new clicker, I'm very excited to say, is we are here to talk about employee engagement programs. This is what we're here for. We all represent one of the stakeholders that's in my diagram. We have companies, we have the esteemed vendors, we have charities, and I'd like to think that most of us in the room are also donors. So we are the four stakeholders that comprise a successful employee engagement program. And the goal that we all share, even though we might have different perspectives, we all want successful employee programs that drive funding to charities to create significant community impact. That's what we want. And for that to happen, we have to have the donor funding going to the charities so they can make that happen. So in this model, you can see how these parties can connect. So the donor wants to give to the charity, because we love our donors, but the donors have to have that opportunity given to them. The company makes that opportunity available to them. But they make that opportunity really attractive with the wonderful technology that the vendor provides. The vendor actually helps them deliver that opportunity to the employee. But the vendor is helped by the charity when the charity can provide content to make that platform much more attractive, much more engaging, and a better donor experience. So all of us work together. But this isn't a one-way street. The company needs the donor to be participating because they have goals. And they want their program to be a success. But they have CSR goals, they have metrics, they want to report this out. So they want the donor participating, not just donor giving money, they want the donor participating in the program. So therefore, the company has a robust program, and they have business. They have business to bring to the vendor, and the vendor processes that business and all the transactions. And when the vendor has all that data, they can share it with the charity. The charity uses that data for their own metrics, their own projections, their own plans and programs, and they also get the donor information, and they cultivate that donor. So here we create that relationship between the donor and the charity. And this is the crux of what a lot of donors want. They want that relationship. Because has anyone in this room ever talked with a donor that's not happy? That's not fun. It's not fun, and we try to avoid that at all times. Because the goal is to have a happy donor, because a happy donor is a happy employee. And a happy employee makes your programs a success. And your successful programs make community change. So we all need each other, but more and more with technology, there is an area where this breaks down. So the charities may not be getting all the information that they need. Maybe they don't necessarily know where to look for it. Maybe they're not sure how to interpret it. Maybe they're not aware that some of the certification and the vetting steps and process they need to go through are necessary. Otherwise, they're leaving opportunities on the table because they're not aware of them. Maybe they're not properly confirming gifts they've received in order to participate in the matching gift program. Maybe they're not certifying volunteer hours for Dollars for Doers programs. Who knows what the situation is, but worst of all, on the basic level, they may not be pulling their donor information, and therefore they're not thanking that donor. You want to talk about some angry donors. And when those donors call that charity and say, I made a gift to you through my company, and I'm calling to see if you received the matching gift yet, and the charity says, no. And the donor says, well, have you received my gift? And the charity says, no. All of a sudden, you've got a very unhappy donor. And that donor loses trust in your program and doesn't participate. The company doesn't meet its goals. You try to revamp your program, you're wondering why it's stagnant or declining. You try to change it. Maybe you change vendors, thinking that's a solution. And at the end of the day, worst case scenario, maybe you even drop your program. So this is bad, and this is what we want to avoid. But we have to ask ourselves, why is it happening? And the answer is because of portals. Okay, it's the proliferation of portals. And this slide is only a mere illustration. I picked logos that I like. I picked companies that I work with frequently, and I love them. But the point of this slide is that landscape, the 10, 12 logos that are up there, that changes frequently. It's very dynamic, and companies change vendors. They might use more than one vendor. I'd like to see a show of hands. Think about all of your Dollars for Doers, your matching gift program, your employee giving. How many of you use more than one vendor for your, yeah. So you can start to see why it gets a little difficult for charities to track all of this, because portals shifts the burden from the company or the vendor or the federation who's pulling the data and giving it to the charities. The charities need to go on and pull it for themselves. And in theory, that sounds great. What's not to like? The charity can get the data they need when they need it. It's a perfect technology solution, except that there are just so many of them, and they're all different. And companies use multiple vendors, or they're transitioning from one and using another, but both are still sending out distributions for the same company. And honing in even just on a single portal might entail logging into numerous accounts, because each account is tied to a different company that's using that vendor. So you're still logging in multiple times over and over and over again. And it's a lot of work, and it's a new landscape for charities, and they're overwhelmed. And I think I can speak for all the federations in the room. our charities still ask us, and in some cases expect us, to manage all of this for them. So it gets really tricky, and at EarthShare, I can tell you, my staff love me, we have a list of over 200 portal links, web accounts, user IDs, passwords, the whole 9 yards, because those are all sites where we're accessing the information for our members because they're not able to do so for themselves. So, the thing is, it's not just about reporting. Portals they should be our best friend. They allow us to shine a light on our charities. But it takes time. And you have to try to educate people that already have very limited staff, limited time, that this is worth their time. It requires onboarding. It requires education. We have to illustrate the point to them, why this is important. They can get more money. Go through the certification steps. Trust me. It takes time. A guide for a charity to register on a portal can be 39 pages. 39 pages, and that's one portal. That is a lot. There are different types of questions, different certifications that are done on different sites. Some, you have to keep them up to date. Sometimes questions are added after a charity thinks they've already completed their certifications, and then they find out from an Apple employee that they're not appearing on the list, and they weren't aware that there were new certifications that were added, so they had to log back in and get up to date. So there are issues with that. So if you can talk a charity into taking the time to getting through the registration process, the verification, the vetting, then you have to try to get them to take it further. Put that rich content on there that makes that platform so much better, and that donor has a better experience. We want them to put that content on there. Otherwise, you're lucky if you get a logo, an address, and a website. And that's not very appealing to donors, in my opinion. So federations do this a lot of education, ongoing, hand-holding. We do this for the members. And it's really important when we have that opportunity to work with these systems and the vendors to figure out a way, and we actually did this a lot. We've partnered a lot with a vendor that helped us fast track that whole verification process. The thing is, as a federation, we have certification statements, non-discrimination policies. We have tax substantiation documents. We have all of this on hand. We even have their ACH information for all of our member charities. We can do this for them if the vendor can work with us to help us facilitate this. So we've had some progress in that area, so that's really encouraging. But just when you think you're going in the right direction, all those cats are moving in the same way, there's staff turnover, and you just have to start all over again. So what you find is charities, like I said, that are lost, they're overwhelmed, they're asking for all kinds of help. I picked a few charities that I've worked with quite a bit to walk them through this process and navigate the waters, and I asked them if they could just maybe send me a couple sentences or two so you can see what they're experiencing. And these statements are from as small of an organization as 1 million in revenues and only 10 employees, up to 33 million and 175 employees. So it's not just the really small organizations that just can't handle this, it's large organizations. So these are services that traditionally were handled for them, and it's harder and harder for federations to continue to monitor it and make sure things are still happening, donors are still being thanked. We don't want anyone falling through the cracks, because when that happens, you're dealing with angry donors again. And all this extra time that these charities have to spend on multiple sites doing duplicative services and entry goes to their overhead. And you might recall Dan Pallotta's TED Talk, where he said, Overhead really is not a bad thing. The overhead is a necessary investment for growth. You might also remember the Three Musketeers, the Mythbusters, Charity Navigator, GuideStar, and the Better Business Bureau Wise Giving Alliance. They teamed up to dispel that overhead myth. But the reality is, you and I, all of us in this room, understand this. But the pervasive mentality of society and the donors is that charities with low overhead are more effective. And some people in the room here, the charities, know that in the Combined Federal Campaign, there is a federation called Charities with Overhead Under 5%. It's not a joke. There's even a federation called Charities with Overhead Under 1%. So how effective do you think those charities are? The problem is, it's what is called as a starvation cycle. So the state of our charities today, and I hope, that looks blurry to me, but I don't have my glasses on. I hope you can read that. Charities are so focused on keeping that low overhead, so they're appealing to donors, that they forego the necessary investment in information systems, quality staff, experienced staff, and they have fewer staff, they have high staff turnover, they have poor systems that often don't even talk to each other, poor donor data management systems. So it's no wonder that things can slip through the cracks, because this is the state of our charities today. So when we layer onto this the complexities and the variety and the sheer volume of the portals and the technology required for charities to manage these portals, you can see that it just adds stress to the situation. But that's why we're all here today, and that's what this session's all about. So I have queued it up for this team to talk about these conversations that they've been having to bring us all up to speed.
Thank you.
Brilliant. So before we do, I just want to let you know, the one thing that makes this conference a little different is that we don't shy away from the tough issues. Second session, let's just jump into the deep end and see if we sink or swim. So we didn't pull any punches, and it's only going to get worse. So this might be uncomfortable for you, especially if you just wrap up your RP or whatnot. But by the end, we're actually going to put it to you to come up with part of the answer, to collaboratively work with us to address this issue of the one-offs and the huge problem that we have of inefficiency. I think Carol Cohn set it up well for us to talk about what it looks like when a corporate citizen steps up to the plate to be the leader that we expect them to be and hope them to be. But now we're talking about a very tactical issue to make that a reality in the world. And this is a big issue, and if you haven't dealt with it and you're thinking, what's the big deal? Just lean over to the person next to you and say, you know, how accurate is there that much energy? Oh, you don't even know. Like, you don't even want to get me started. It's crazy. Kevin, tell us a little bit more about the dream you had last year and where we are in it.
The dream, yes. Yes, perfect. Well, first, I'm going to remain seated because I almost fell off of one of these one time. And I'm really afraid of the edge. So I had everybody move back.
That's true.
But before I dive into the details, I wanted to take it up a level, and I will get to the dream. And just let you know where I'm coming from, like what's driving me at a higher level, and then we'll get into those nitty-gritty details, because it's necessary. You have to understand what the problems are at that level in order to move them forward to solutions. But for me, I truly believe in radical social change through individual transformation. Radical social change through individual transformation. And let me just dive into that a little bit. Change is hard, right? We have people that go out and they manage change, and you hire them to manage change because it's a long process that needs to happen. I'm going to toss out there that transformation is instant. Transformation in individuals is a second. It's a point in time that you decide something. So when I say radical social change through individual transformation, I mean individuals choosing to do something differently, and the change that can happen over a group, over an industry because of that. So now let's get into some nitty gritty.
That was good.
Last year I got up and I don't think I pounded my fist, but I may have. And I said, you know, our vendors aren't all of the problem. I think I said that our vendors aren't the problem. It's because we have unique and special programs that we're driving our vendors to create technology to address those unique and special programs. When in fact, we are special, but our programs aren't that unique. And there's a lot of things that we can do together in collaborating that we can take a lot of the minutia out of our jobs of figuring out we're all individuals trying to do it all. So when we look at problems that come up, like what are we going to do in terms of discrimination policy, right? We're all going out there and talking to our legal and talking to different things to figure out what our individual policy is. And wouldn't it be great if we could get some people together that have different programs, but come together to figure out, well, really there's 4 things that you can do, right? You can either choose to have everyone in, you can choose to have no one in, you can choose to develop a policy that says as appropriate by law, or you can choose to develop a policy that dives deeper and says, no, we're not going to do that based on this attestation or whatever gets pulled out there. Now, wouldn't it be easier if we had a group of the companies that represent those areas that could come together, put that together, and then disseminate that across everyone? So we can have one voice across all of us. It doesn't mean one choice, but one voice across all, so that we can get rid of a lot of the inefficiencies that we're all doing today. So that's where I got up, and I may have pounded my fist and said we've got to make something happen. We need to get together. We need to collaborate to transform. So based on that, and I think I ended with an African proverb that was, if we want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And after pounding my fist and getting down, I heard from a lot of you that were there, and a lot of folks that are in the industry that said, you know what, this really resonates. I don't have time to do all of these things. Let's come together. Let's start to build that collaboration. Let's find the industry's toughest challenges, and let's stop talking about them. Let's transform in ourselves and understand that we want to do something different, and get with like-minded people to start talking about that change, start talking about where we're going to go rather than the challenge, and rather than continuously bringing up where we're at and why we can't go forward. So what we did, we set out to just listen. And Bridget from Boeing, not just Boeing, wanted to join and say, what can we do together? We're doing a lot of the same things. Let's come together, and also Sheila from TechSoup. And we decided to go out to a 4-city listening tour. A lot of you guys were invited. How many folks attended one of those? A few. Perfect. And what we found was we went to San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, and New York. And we just said this exact thing. We said, can't we do something together? Can we not collaborate and draw out some of these inefficiencies in our industry? And we came up with, literally the first one was in San Francisco, and we had boards of all of the issues that we face. And then we went through and said, here's the ones that we've been working on for a long time. And then we said, the afternoon is going to be spent diving into just a couple of those issues. And we're going to move the needle. We're going to move it forward, and we're going to start to define out what are some of those solutions that can address that. Let's stop talking about it. Let's start moving in the right direction. And as we went to each of these cities, we started to pull that information together and saw some trends. And we saw trends around vetting, biggest one, vetting and global vetting, like what the hell are we all going to do? Skill-based volunteering, and vetting, skills-based volunteering,
International, but you got that one, global.
international, yeah, global, yeah. And we started to dive into those for the remaining 3 sessions, and started to really push the bar in those areas and say, what can we do? Let's listen. Let's bring the data together on the problem, but then let's spend these afternoons on the solution. How can we push it forward? And those sessions were fantastic. And we learned a lot, and we've consolidated those, saw some of the trends. And what we wanted to do here is take that same idea that started here with a challenge to everyone that was here last year to collaborate, and have everyone experience that today and dive into one of these areas and really experience that in a deeper way. So with that, I'll end with, or pass the mic over to Bridget to share a little bit more about why she engaged in the conversation, why it was important to her, and then specifically what they've gotten out of this, and then Sheila will go on and help with the one we're diving into.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And good afternoon, everyone. Like Chris said, I dealt with quite a bit to get here this afternoon, but I'm glad I made it. So my name's Bridget Sweeney. I'm our operations director for our corporate citizenship programs there. And I've been with Boeing about 11 years now. And one of the main things that has been throughout my tenure at Boeing, but definitely in the last 7 or so years, is that we really want to operate as a global company. About 70% of our customer base is outside the US, but just less than 10% of our employee base is outside the US. But it's been a very important initiative for our company to really operate as a global company and bring our international employees into our very US-centric programs and policies and whatnot. And so this has been going on, and corporate citizenship has not been an exception to this. In fact, many of the HR representatives, whatnot, thought bringing corporate citizenship programs to our international employee base would be a quick win and very easy. But what has actually turned out is that it's not very easy, as all of us in the room are probably familiar with. So for about the past 5 or so years, we've really been trying to bring these programs internationally, and cultural and sort of employee interest issues aside, the number one thing that we kept running into for scaling our programs was really around this global vetting process for our NGO partners. Now, one thing about Boeing is that we are a government contractor, and we also, given the nature of our products and our customer base, have to go through an extreme level of scrutiny by our law department for any relationships that we have with NGOs outside the US. So whether it's a monetary donation of $2,000 or $500,000, or any sort of Boeing-sponsored employee engagement, volunteer activity, charity run, it needs to be thoroughly vetted by our law department. And so that's really made it difficult to scale these relationships where we know that the employee engagement is really driven by employee interest, but we're not able to bring more and more of these nonprofits that our employees are interested into the fold, because we just don't have the resources or manpower to be doing a full-on law review of every single nonprofit. And so we've tried a couple different things and kept running into issues, and we started thinking, are we the only ones that are facing this problem? Do we have to go this alone? Do we have to create something new? Do we have to become experts in-house? We have to hire extra lawyers at Boeing just to do vetting of nonprofits, which would never fly. And so we started doing a lot of research, and we talked to a lot of different companies, we talked to nonprofits, we looked at all sorts of online resources, talked to vendors, and it just seemed again and again we ran into, everyone was sort of dealing with the same issues. How do we scale these programs outside the US? But it wasn't till we talked to Microsoft and Kevin specifically when we identified and sort of commiserated over the same issues, but when he said, you know what, I want to find a solution to this. Let's work together to really try to streamline some of these things that seem very disparate and siloed. And immediately at Boeing, my leadership, everyone was said, you know what, yes, we've had enough of trying to do this ourselves. Let's work together. And so that's when we partnered up with Microsoft just about 2 years ago, and set out on how do we do this? How do we leverage technology? How do we think about not only ourselves, our special programs, as Kevin mentioned, but how do we think about what's best for the nonprofit who we're ultimately trying to serve? And so that's when we really started working much more closely together, and Microsoft pulled in their longtime partner, TechSoup Global, who is cracking the code on this global vetting process. And they're doing this through technology and global partnerships. So together, we've started talking, and as Kevin mentioned, we went on this 4-city collaborative tour where again and again, we just kept hearing that this issue with vetting, and how do we make it easier for the nonprofits so they're not interfacing with all these different portals that are asking almost the same questions in maybe a slightly different way for all of our own corporate law departments to do the same reviews again and again. And it really was an eye-opening experience, and what we promised ourselves is at the end of this 4-city tour is that we were going to kick off in the new year with more information and to start building action plans around that. This is our first opportunity this year to engage a whole new group of folks in the conversation. And so we're really looking forward to the small group conversations that we're going to have in a few short moments to really think about and add to the action plans that we've already started building. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sheila Warren, who is part of TechSoup Global, and they really have just about cracked this code on this global vetting, and they're using technology to do it. So Sheila?
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks, Kevin.
Careful.
Yeah, I was going to do a little walking style thing, and Kevin, I'll disappoint some of you by telling you this is not my real speaking voice, but my plan B is to, seduce you all into drinking my Kool-Aid on vetting here with this new exciting voice that I have. So how many of you have heard of TechSoup Global, first of all? Oh, see, that was either going to depress me or make me really happy, and I'm glad it made me really happy. Okay, I'll tell you a little bit about us for those who aren't familiar. We were founded in '87. We used to be known as Compumentor, so that name may ring bells if TechSoup Global does not ring bells. We're a social enterprise out of San Francisco. We are a 501c3 ourselves, a charitable organization, but the social enterprise bit means that over 90% of our revenue is generated by business and admin fees. So we only have less than 10% of our revenue from grants, which gives us a lot of flexibility to experiment with things like creating vetting standards, as Bridget and Kevin have noted. We're best known for our product donation platform. So we work with over 100 tech companies throughout the world, some non-US companies as well. And we help them donate either discounted or fully donated software, hardware, et cetera, to, at this point, it's actually 700,000 as of last week, nonprofits in, at present, 121 countries. And we're on track to be in 200 countries by July 1st, which my team is leading, which is not at all stressful or a tight timeline, especially considering you might imagine the 121 that we're in are the easy ones, right? So there you have it. This has led us, as I think Chris noted, at this point, excuse me, we have facilitated the donation distribution of over $5 billion worth of technology resources to nonprofits. Really proud of that number, as you might imagine. I came to TechSoup about 5 years ago from a private law practice, and I came to design, run, and launch something called NGO Source. You may have heard of NGO Source if you haven't heard of TechSoup Global. And it's so interesting to me, when Kevin first came to us and we started talking about the standards and the issues around vetting, it was so familiar, right? We had these same conversations with our partner, the Council on Foundations, starting back in '06, with foundations and the foundation community, where the issue was, as you can see here, right, at first, every one of these foundation grant makers, A, B, and C, was going independently to a nonprofit in a foreign country, asking them slightly different questions, like annoyingly different, right? Like kind of the same, but not quite the same, like college applications that we all had to go through at some point. Frustrating, right? And I have a different one, a slide I didn't bring today, but it really shows that red box just getting smaller and smaller and smaller as the resources of that NGO get diminished and dwindled, right? So what NGO Source does is it created a global legal standard around what's called equivalency determinations. That is a legal standard required by the IRS and Treasury as one option for foundations to make grants. Matt Nelson is smiling because he was there at the beginning with the council on this and knows this history really well. So you can ask him about it if you don't want to ask me. We work with our global partners. As Bridget mentioned, we currently have partners in 38 countries. Those are local NGOs on the ground that know their country and region's legal code extremely well. But more than that, I think, because we could learn the law, they know the cultural context of that society, right? Which is a critical thing that is not often considered. But you might have regulation or a law, but the way it's applied in a country means it's completely different. It might even be obsolete. So we launched this in 2013. At this point, we're just under 2 years of service. Next week is the anniversary, which is exciting. And of the 10 largest grant makers, we're talking Ford, Gates, Rockefeller, Hewlett, et cetera, 8 of them are already members. So it's a really exciting service. And as you can see, the issues were exactly the same. And let me tell you, convincing general counsels of these foundations that they should all use the same legal standard, not so easy. But we did it. We got the IRS, Treasury, and State Department to essentially approve this concept, and we're able to get it done. I find this challenge, frankly, to be so much more straightforward than that one was, to be really honest. Okay, here's our global network. Again, we're in 35 languages, 38 partners, 121 countries, going to be in 200 by July 1. And I already mentioned the importance of this, I think, is less the on-the-ground presence, which I think is important as well, but many players, I think, have that. Many of your companies have offices in these countries. What I think is critical is that we work with established capacity-building NGOs. So we're very picky about our partners. There's a reason we don't have partners in 121 countries. We haven't found in many countries a partner we think is up to our standards to help us do some of this vetting and establish some of these rules and regulations around how we do it. Okay. So our approach to vetting, because I'm focusing on vetting today, is to apply a global policy or process to local context. So what does that mean? Right? You can think about this in 2 ways, and this is a debate that we have internally all the time. One is, are we exporting an American standard? Are we looking for a 501c3 organization? That's what NGO Source does, by the way, right? So any organization that comes through the NGO Source program, if it were housed in the US, would actually be a 501c3 public charity. Okay, that's just the rule, that's the law. But that's not what I think most of us are looking for from a corporate perspective. When we're using corporate dollars or a gift match or employees, we don't want the 501c3 equivalent necessarily. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, right? What we probably want is to understand, what does that society, what do those laws in that country consider charitable, right? So what does that mean? That means in 121, almost 200 to be soon, TBD countries, we have evaluated the law in that country. Okay, so I should pause here, and I'll tell, Chris loves it when I say this, there's this huge mythology that I think none of you have fallen for in this room, but if you go back to your offices, you're gonna hear, oh, well, this is so easy in the US. This is just a global problem. When you're in the US, it's simple. It is not simple in the US at all, okay, at all, as you know. How do you deal with fiscally sponsored organizations? What about religious organizations? We have so many, I have a cluster, I was with a client last week, new to us, and they came in and said, well, we can't serve any religious or political organizations. And I said, okay, well, what does that mean to you? Well, we just can't do anything with religion or politics at all. And anyway, I said, okay, well, here's some examples, right? Did you know X organization, big nationally known organization, has very Christian roots? And if you look in their charter, it's actually very rooted in Christian theology. But the way that's expressed and kind of known to the public, you have no idea. Oh, well, that one's probably okay. Okay. Okay, so how are we going to assess politics? Right? Well, we can just get the organization to say they don't do political activity. I said, all right, well, if you ask Planned Parenthood, the C3 arm, do we do politics? Absolutely not. Not forbidden by the tax code, no way, we don't do it at all. well, I think Planned Parenthood's kind of political. She responds to me, and I said, yeah, that's kind of hard. So it's not at all easy in the US. And when you export this abroad, it's multifactorial. You can imagine how hard this is. So we just completed reviewing. I'm really proud to announce we have Afghanistan in our books now, new country for us. And there are there's associations and NGOs in Afghanistan. I'm kind of nerd out right now, so sorry, but this is kind of exciting. So, and people say, well, I only want registered organizations in a country. As long as there's registered with the government, I'm good. Okay, well, some registries are held by hand by a tribal councilman. You can bribe your way onto it. They're never updated. Do you mean that registry? And in Afghanistan, it turns out there are 2 registries. One is with the Ministry of Justice, one with the Ministry of Economy. And with one of those, you have to certify that you adhere to Islamic law, but not with the other one. Does that matter to you? Do you care? You might care. I'm suspecting some of you might care, right? Depending on who you are and what you do. So this is the stuff that we wrestle with and wrestle to the ground every day. And as you can imagine, when you go global, when you think about how to source these things, when you think about who do we really want to serve and help, you have to take into account the compliance, the risk for your company, the number of employees, your mission fit, and then you have to take into account, who do you really want to be working with on the ground? Right? What's going to give the biggest impact? What's going to give the biggest reward to your employees, to yourselves, frankly, right? Okay, so, this is a build. I didn't know that, huh? There you go, it's built now. So we've created standards twice. Okay, so one is the NGO source example I gave. I consider that extremely elite, challenging vetting. It's expensive vetting because it has to be consistent with US tax law, right? So it's a very prescribed method of doing that kind of service, and we offer, as that part of that service, a legal opinion, which is expensive, right? Then we have our project donation program. So a thing that's not considered that often, and this is even eye-opening to Kevin, I think, I'll call you out when I mention it this way, because we have a long-standing relationship with Microsoft, is that we've convinced 100 tech companies, again, some with non-US roots, to use essentially what amounts to the same standards of vetting for their project donation programs. Right? We've done that. And at some point, when you have enough companies on board, the wheel has turned and it's gathered enough moss and whatnot and rolling down the hill kind of thing. It's fine, it snowballs. But at the beginning, we had to go around and say, well, in-kind donation, here's the law, here's your mission fit, here's what you want to do, And what it comes down to for me is really thinking about 2 things. One is your risk tolerance, and one is your mission. Okay, so everybody here can tell me, I'm sure, or maybe you're working this out right now, what's your corporate priority this year? What is your charitable giving corporate priority? It's often children, it's youth, it's education, it's literacy, it's water, it's whatever it is, right? You kind of know that one. So you know that you want to make sure that more organizations, let's say, with that mission type are going to be in your database of serviceable organizations, right? And maybe this year you're just not focused on the other ones. That's fine. We can easily filter that for you, right? And you can imagine a world in which you agree. There's a standard around what does it mean to be a literacy organization? Is it enough to work with children? In education, do you kind of assume literacy? Do you have to explicitly be about literacy? These things aren't easy either, right? And the other one is your risk profile. So as you can imagine, as Bridget noted, government contracts, very different risk profile, right, than maybe a tech company. Startup, different from a bank. Tech startup, bank, not the same risk profile. And you have different risk profiles across your various programs too, right? So maybe if it's just volunteering with no gift match, no dollars, no cash is ever going to those organizations, you might say, broader set of organizations. We're okay with fiscal sponsorship in that instance. We're okay with religious organizations. We want people supporting their church, that counts, right? But if we're going to do a cash match, maybe we want a narrower set of organizations, right? So you think about how to filter. So this is kind of the structure that, as we went on our roadshow of these 4 listening tours, we came up with this concept together. Okay, this is not exactly how TechSoup does it today. This is what we're hoping to get more feedback on today to figure out if this makes sense as the approach. Okay, so when you think about this, you can kind of walk through it, and we just use Microsoft as an example here because I didn't think Kevin would mind. So you have your company. You think about the stringency of your program. Is this a filter that makes sense to you? Is what we're going to ask you, right? Does this work? Because at first we thought, well, we could have the same way that we did in-kind donations and NGO source, we could have a volunteering standard. But we quickly realized it's way too complicated. The way you think about volunteering, sometimes it's really cash-oriented, sometimes it's really not. So that doesn't really make sense. It's really more about your risk profile. And then this mission idea, if you could just have a list and you check off the boxes, what might those boxes be? Is it the standard, the Big Ten, we kind of call them? literacy, water, poverty, those girls, women, girls, that kind of thing? Or would you want something really granular? You want to really get in there and decide, like we want not just women, but we want reproductive health, or we want domestic abuse, or we want whatever it is, right? Like which of these things do we really want? Those are questions for you as well, okay? And then of course, I haven't even talked about things like FCPA compliance, Bridger anti-terrorism checking, things like that, right? All of which are add-ons that your vendors and we and everyone, kind of thinks about as well, right? And you have different needs there too. Here's another view of this. We kind of map, this is like a generic mapping, very generic mapping. You can imagine this very stringent standard being for cash, right? Where you're worried about everything from, okay, the bank's got to move the money and be willing to do it. There has to be a kind of a known recipient on the other end with the bank, this kind of stuff. You've got this medium level where it's, okay, it's stuff's going over. It's our stuff, our brand's on it, but we feel a little more comfortable because we're kind of controlling distribution channel, right? So maybe we aren't as worried about the bank issue or the tax implications because we control it. And then you've got the most inclusive, again, this is just a theoretical, hypothetical here, and that would maybe be, hey, everyone, go out and do good in your community, right? And we just want some kind of assurance that the org you're working for is not, what was it? Lunchboxes for Hamas was, I think, the one that someone came up with. It's not lunchboxes for Hamas, right? And it's also, I don't know how you talk about Hamas. And it's also not, it's not a for-profit. You're not working for like your husband's company or whatever, right? Kind of thing. So, but apart from that, we're probably pretty good. So this is the way we kind of started thinking about parsing these requirements into a set of data here. Okay, that's my last slide.
All right, perfect. Okay, so she was going to sit down, but we're going to talk to her. She's one of the smartest people I know. And when I first got this kind of unpacked for me, my mind went, boo, because it blew my mind a little bit. There's so much going on in the back end, but there's an opportunity for us to come together to decide to work together on these standards and processes. So what we want to do, there's two parts of this. Create a framework, agree to a framework. This would probably take 10, 20 years, but agree to a framework. It's got to start in some generation, might as well be us, right? And then use the framework. And using the framework means then reaching out to the vendors that are using back-end processes to move money and other kinds of valuation around and get them to adopt this framework, okay? So it's two parts of this whole thing. And we began with the perspective of the nonprofit and how all these multiple portals are a heavy task for an individual nonprofit. But we're focusing the rest of this conversation on another aspect of what we could possibly address through collaborating, through creating a framework, and then using that framework in terms of vetting. But you see how this also applies to the nonprofits. We all agreed to a portal or a standard list that could populate numerous vendors, and then they draw from that information. It's a one-stop shop. I put up my profile, put up the opportunities, whatever we all agreed to, and it kind of goes out. So there's multiple applications for this, but we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about the vetting one. Before we do that, I think we need to allow ourselves to ask a few questions of Sheila about some of this information which may be new to us. And feel free to ask that question from your own particular situation. It does not matter if it's relevant to anybody else in the room. It will be. So ask that question. If there's something that was said, or she used a lot of acronyms that maybe didn't make any sense, we can ask what those are too. No dumb questions. We're in the deep end, so let's swim. Any questions about, yes, over here. Best Buy. Oh, Tiffany, before you go. Lena Klebanoff is on the advisory council. She works for Time Warner. Yeah. There was apparently some discussion about asking her to leave. We changed her mind. She's still on. You're still on, Lena, wherever you are. You're in. Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry about the miss earlier. All right, now, Tiffany. No, we can't hear you. You have to yell.
Can you draw some parallels for domestic? You just did some great examples of international global vetting, but how would this relate to a company that is just domestic?
Sure, yeah. So some of the things I think people struggle with are, again, this definition of religious and political. That's one we hear all the time, and every company has a different view on this. And we've come up with like a baseline to start with our tech companies we work with, but it's always all over the map, right? That's one. I think the use of fiscal sponsorship is another one. Fiscally sponsored organizations are 501c3, but they're umbrella organizations that sponsor projects, if you don't know what they are, right? So Tides is the classic example. There's a whole bunch of them that are in this space. And some companies work with them and some don't. You know, they aren't comfortable if there's not an independent 501c3 letter for the project, right? So an incubation doesn't work. There's some companies that don't want to serve organizations that are within their first 5 years of existence. That's another one, right? So there's time, things like that. Other things we see, multi-branches. So there's some companies that want to be able to donate directly to a branch. We see this with the YMCA all the time. So they want to be able to give to YMCA Chicago, not YMCA National. Do you care about that? Does it matter? You know, it varies widely. So those are just off the top of my head some examples of things that we see at TechSoup from our companies we work with. And I also think there are organizations that are comfortable in the volunteering space with, another one, great one, non-C3 libraries, right? That's another big one. And then private schools versus public schools versus universities. I mean, that's another one we see all the time too. But there are some, like I was going to say, there are some organizations that are really comfortable working with voluntary firefighter associations, which can be C4s, 501c4s, or some that want to work with business chambers of commerce and business leagues, right, C6s and C7s. I mean, there's all these different options for charity that don't require tax deductibility. And the question is, do you want to be able to have people volunteer there or do you not? You know, do you want to be able to give gifts there that aren't deductible necessarily or not? It really varies. Yeah.
And so I'll just add on from a level up from the detailed vetting piece, but just from when we looked across my programs and across the company, we had 6 different
Standards.
Organizations vetting for us, for our volunteer, for our giving, for our in-kind, for our programs. So individually, they were each great until you looked horizontally and said, wait a second, we can't get reporting across these things. We can't get, we have different standards. Within our own company, we had different standards for our different programs. So we said, that's a little bit ridiculous. Maybe we need to clean up this. And that's what started to kind of open up the doors to say, whoa, if we're doing it and Boeing's doing it, then we're all doing it.
Mm-hmm. Good question. Thanks, Sid. Yeah.
Scott Jackson, Global Impact. When you looked at the paradigm, did you factor in some of the donor requirements? We just completed a 9-country Southeast Asian study for the Gates Foundation, and we found that the vetting level was very important to match with whether or not you wanted donors in a given country to receive their own tax deduction. But do you have kind of a donor set of criteria that you've included, or was that found in the listening tour to be of concern?
Yeah. Again, that varies widely. People who care really care. People who don't care have never even heard of it. So for us, there's a layer of tax deductible or not that crosses everything. So some companies say, I only want to give if it's deductible both to a US donor domestically and to a foreign donor giving in country. And some even say, I'd prefer to know if it's deductible to a US donor to cross border, right? That's obviously the smaller, the set gets smaller and smaller the more that you require that kind of thing. So we at TechSoup always filter by deductibility in a country first, and then we have a broader set for in-kind donations that's about just charitable organizations in that country. But yeah, again, you either really care or you're like, I don't know what you're talking about.
So would you include that as part of the risk framework, that diagram that you put up there that we couldn't read? Is that?
Oh yeah, I know you could.
But we all had the
I didn't intend for
impression
you to
there was some good thinking behind it. So that's.
We can put it back up if you want.
Would you include that as part of that?
Well, I think so,
Yeah.
right? Because I think if you are highly risk averse, tax deductibility is going to help you a lot, because it's something that you know is regulated by the government. It's really truly regulated, not just like regulated, like someone's really looking at that, presumably, as opposed to other things that are not being viewed or reviewed or audited by any body. Yeah.
Another question? Yes, Gina. Hey, it's your birthday. It is your birthday,
Happy
right?
birthday.
That's
Funny.
weird.
It is.
That's weird.
I'm
yeah,
sorry for
interesting.
your mom.
Yeah, it's a long
And you
day.
can tell
Small
us about
town.
it. Yeah, okay. Whatever, that's weirder. Ask your question.
So back to kind of the domestic.
Yeah.
I think this goes with our situation. Help me understand the difference, what you would offer versus what we use Charity Navigator for now.
Good question.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question. So I don't want to comment specifically on us versus Ken's organization because there's a Venn diagram in there, but they do a lot of things that we TechSoup don't do at all, and we do a lot of things they don't do at all, right? But in that middle, I would say the overlap is looking at domestically C3 status. Right? So Charity Navigator focuses on 501c3 public charities primarily. But what they do is look a lot more at budgetary overhead kinds of things and kind of operationally rating charities. We don't have any, we at TechSoup are this is a pretty consistent theme for us, is we don't evaluate charities. We don't look and see, are they a good charity or a bad charity or whatever. We think that that's not our place or our business, and there's too much complexity in the business models or in the need of a particular community for us to be in a position to do that, right? So we don't do that at all. What we do is we have a broader set of organizations that we look at, both domestically and of course internationally, right? So we do an evaluation on not just status, but we look at these other organizations that are considered charitable by most people, but that aren't filtered through a 990, right? So churches is a great example, or places of worship is a great example. No 990 for most of them, but they're still charitable organizations. Schools is another great one. Some do file 990, some don't file 990. So we just have a much bigger set of orgs that we look at, I would say. Yeah.
And I should say, if you've got another question, TechSoup is not a vendor like the vendors in
Right.
the other room that provide services for moving dollars and people. They don't do volunteer management or giving programs. What we're talking about is working with them in a collaborative way to create a framework and use the framework that then the vendors can use instead and have an option to say a motto or setting up a donor advised fund in 200 countries. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about building pulleys with machines instead of by hand. Yeah, so, and I do want to say we are going to involve the vendors directly in the conversation, but Ryan, you have a question right now?
I just wanted to ask
Ryan's with Coscast. Thanks.
I just wanted to ask how far along you are in this process, because I can tell you the vendor do once.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I know we've talked, yeah. So we're pretty far along, honestly. I mean, we've been doing this for a while. I think the only thing that's really new to us is the way we would think about this risk profile kind of thing. But we have the data set. We already have all the fields we'd need to pull up into this new way of thinking about applying it. And I think what's my big light bulb, which happened on after the San Francisco city tour, was this realization that the way we were thinking about this as a volunteering standard or a cash standard or whatever, that wasn't really going to be universal truly, because everyone's programs are so different, right? And what really would make the more sense would be this risk assessment, how difficult are your lawyers, I guess is kind of what it comes down to, right? And I've talked to a lot of your lawyers, so I know some of them are more than others. I'm middle, I guess. And then also this mission fit. So it's a different way of diving into our set and parsing our set, for example.
And
we're
Sheila is
pretty
a
far
lawyer
along.
herself, so
I'm a lawyer,
she's
yeah.
a big fan of lawyer jokes. Okay, we'll take
Yeah,
one
right.
more.
They're all accurate. It's really fun.
Stephen, can we take you, and then we're going to get to the tables, okay? The table work. Go ahead. Just yell.
Yeah, everybody anyone knows me knows I can yell.
You sound great.
Jeff Finder from VA Systems, and I think my question, having been on both the nonprofit side and the vendor side before 4 years ago coming over to the corporate side, is have we as corporations had the conversation of not how do we change the charities, how do we change the vendors, but how do we all realize, as you said, we're not all that different?
Mm-hmm.
Our programs don't need to be that special.
Mm-hmm.
Can we find common ground in our programs so there's not 85 different variations of a matching gifts program? It's not even about the charities, it's about our programs and saying, can there be a universal standard across companies in how we do employee engagement that fits all the slots that we needed to fit from a community perspective and still gives us the flexibility to be true to our corporate culture?
It sounds like you have a dream, and I think that is a great, great dream. Am I wrong? Is that?
We passed the fist pounding on.
Yeah, there we go.
And can I
Yeah,
just
but
add to that?
Yeah.
I'll just say, I mean, I think that is the dream. And I think when we first went to Foundation and started saying, you guys are all doing equivalency determination, and really, you're kind of all doing it the same. I mean, it was like, you got to be kidding me. No way. Ours is way more strict than theirs, and they don't do them right, and da-da-da-da. And so we're like, well, let's have an NDA, and let's look. And so we got everyone's documents, and we're like, yeah. Actually, the funny thing was the people who thought they were doing this amazing job maybe weren't, and the people who thought they were not doing enough were kind of way over what they had to be doing, But at the end of the day, it was like 80% of it was exactly the same. Exactly the same. So we just looked at that 20% and created a standard around that, and then everyone's like, oh yeah, that sounds great, I love that idea, So it's really, when you really get under there, you realize, under the hood, you realize there's not, as Kevin knows, there's not a lot of difference.
So
in
the
how
first
you're
step to the
executing.
framework that we can all agree to is open up our hoods, and we
Yeah.
take a peek, right? Okay. Stephen?
Stephen Jordan with IO. And what's interesting to me is I've been trying to figure out the analogy to the financial investor infrastructure here. Are we worried about like the New York Stock Exchange level of this? Are we worried about ADRs here? Are we worried about the due diligence of the accounting firms vetting the potential investment classes? What level of this are we kind of worried about? Because from my perspective, if you look at what we do in the companies in terms of allocating the resources here, it's very, very similar to what a money manager does in terms of if they were thinking about it from a financial investment perspective. But instead of, say, helping someone with their 401k to invest in, a mutual fund focused on utilities or industrials, we're helping them to invest in global development products internationally. It's a different name, but it's still money going from one place to another. And so what I've been trying to struggle with here is what level of the service proposition are we really worried about? Is it the due diligence, folks? Is it the packaging of the charities? Where's really the rubber hitting the road here?
Well, that's a question I think for your peers more. I would say to switch language completely. There's a way of thinking about this where you're giving a charity a vetting rating, AAA, AA. You can kind of think of it that way in financial terms, right? And you could imagine that the most risk averse among you are only going to want a certain level of the evaluation, and those are the only orgs you want in, right? And then others of you will say, for certain programs or because of the way my company runs or whatever it is, we're actually comfortable with a Class A or whatever the rating might be, whatever the level might be. So there's ways of thinking about doing it, and to me that's just another way of talking about risk tolerance. That's all. When I think about pension funds, I just think about risk tolerance. That's all it is, right? Classes, security classes, it's all the same thing. So yeah, every way I've thought about this, it just kind of feeds right back into this risk profile and mission fit every time.
And keeping to that, let's not rate them 1,000 times.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's not have 1,000 different ways
That's
of rating
right.
them.
All right, time to, okay, fine.
Of course, oh, there we go. So my question is simple. Can I have the slides?
Yes.
And two, I want to say thank you because in the 6 years I've been doing this work, I kind of feel like we're shooting ourselves in the foot sometimes because of the exact conversations that I have about the broken business cycle. And so literally about 25% of my job is spent educating both nonprofits and employees on why I promise you this is really a good thing. And so by fixing that broken cycle, the evidence can now back it up.
And you have time to do other things, like the work you got hired to do. Okay, great. That's good. Okay, that was a good comment. I'm glad you made it. Okay, at our tables, I got a slide that's going to go up. We're going to discuss amongst yourselves, okay, any one of these bullets, but let's work through them. We got about 15 minutes. This is worth it. There are drinks afterwards, so dive right in. How would a collaborative solution, what would it mean for your company? Okay, so think about this. You can apply it to either the portal for the charities or vetting. Vetting is the one that gets a lot of energy. But a collaborative solution is when we come together and agree to work, find the 80% that we already agree on but just don't know it, and then agree on the other 20% and then set that as the framework, and then we would apply that framework, okay? So what would that solution mean for your company? How will it work or not work for your programs? You might be sitting there going, well, I'm unique. I know everybody's not unique here, but I'm totally unique, because you don't know. Well, we would love to know, okay? That's what we did in the 4 cities. We learned that together. What might be some of the internal roadblocks besides the lawyers? What are some of the other internal roadblocks? Envision the future, totally innovative models. Okay, that can just blue sky that, okay? And then for the vendors in the room, you are free to participate in the conversation, but feel free to bring this in. Well, this sounds great, but I don't know how it's going to work for my business. Like, I'm going to have to redo everything. I just wrote all this code. I have a whole new platform, and I got to go do it again. Are you going to give me the money to do it again? That's crazy. So that could be a part of it, too. Feel free just to express yourselves. We're glad you're here. It makes it real. Okay. Any questions? Nope. Good. Let's go to work.
All right. We're all